There's this metric, this measure that I heard of a few years ago called the cylinder index. And what it is a count all of the cylinders in all the internal combustion engines that you own. And so if you drive a car with a 4-cylinder engine, your cylinder index is 4. But maybe if you have a lawnmower and a weed eater, that's 2 more. And so your cylinder index is 6. I heard about this from my dad and his buddies that he's kept in touch with for years and years, since I think middle school, if not earlier. And one of them, who's done pretty well for himself, lives up in Minnesota, and he's not only got his daily drivers, a couple cars, but he's got some collector cars, an old Dodge Challenger and a Corvette, which both have V8s, and he's got lawn equipment, and not just a lawn mower, but a lawn tractor, and all the things, snow blowers. And not just that, but he's also got a lake house where he's got all this other lawn equipment and snow equipment and boats. So his cylinder index is 70, which is a lot of cylinders. I think mine, if you count the van that my wife drives most of the time, is 13. So electric lawn equipment doesn't count. And so I think a lot of people are moving that direction. But as we get into the book of James again this morning, what we're going to do is we're going to look at these measures of success that, similar to a cylinder index, which is sort of a humorous way of describing something that's of value to you, and maybe in some spheres that's actually very meaningful, and there's bragging rights associated with that, and not just, oh, I've got more cylinders, but the people who actually find their identity in that. And so that's what we're seeing in this next warning in the book of James. And so last week, as you'll recall, we heard about this warning that was issued primarily to Jewish merchants who were traveling and conducting business, and they were boasting, they were arrogant because of the way that they had achieved success in the past, and they found their identity in what they were able to accomplish as far as conducting business. And so this week we will look at this warning to the rich in these communities that James is writing to with very strong language. Matt kind of alluded to this passage a few weeks ago when he spoke. So before we get into this passage and talk about where this group found their identity, where they found their security, we're also going to talk about the implications for us and what does that mean with the way that we handle our wealth, our riches. So join me as I pray and ask God to speak to all of us this morning. Father, money is a touchy subject, and we recognize that you didn't shy away from it. Jesus, in your ministry on earth, and your word is not shy about money. And we know that we can't serve you and money at the same time. And so I ask for a spirit of humility, that you'd help us to let our guards down, to open our hands, and to be open to what you're asking of us. Father, I pray not just for those who are listening, but I pray for my heart as well, that you would keep me humble and help me to recognize where I'm being selfish, where I'm finding my identity in places other than in you. Amen. So as we turn to James chapter 5, verses 1 to 6, read with me. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you. They will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. These are some serious accusations. So let's step quickly through these measures that I kind of alluded to. The first one is the riches, which have rotted. One of the ways that wealth was stored and displayed in this culture is with food and drink. If you had excess food, then you could have these lavish feasts, and this is a way that you would promote yourself and show off your wealth by having way more than enough and inviting your friends, and maybe not your friends, but people that you wanted to impress. You had them over and you just spoiled them with food. But food doesn't last. If you have more than enough and you don't have a refrigerator, even if you do have a fridge, food spoils, it rots. The second measure was garments, clothing. Unlike us today, where we can go to the store and there's really affordable clothing and we just have gobs and gobs of it, most of which we never wear in our closets and drawers. But garments were a sign of wealth and of financial stability in that time. That's why it's so significant when we're told if someone asks us for a cloak, to give it in our tunic as well. I think I got that right. But clothing was a sign of security. It was not just a covering, but it was also a way that people showed off their wealth. And then gold and silver, the benefit of precious metals is that they were a relatively small way to consolidate wealth. You could transport it. It was portable. If you were traveling, this is arguably the best way to carry your wealth with you. But each of these have rotted, they're moth-eaten, and they've corroded. The image that came to mind as I was thinking through these three things is that of a stream running downhill. And imagine with me this fresh water flowing down a mountain and providing life and nourishment to everything along its banks. It's springtime and we're gardening, and so every day we go out and we check our plants. And when there's ample water, things are flourishing. And you can imagine wildlife coming to the stream and partaking and being sustained. Now imagine that someone obstructs the flow of that stream and blocks it, dams up the stream such that it pools. And rather than providing life downstream to everything that has access to this riverbed, there's a pond that has no movement and it stagnates. And so whoever dams it up effectively hoards this precious resource to themselves, but it spoils. And it grows stagnant. And that's another image that we're seeing here is these rich people were gathering all this stuff for themselves, more than they deserved, and they were just keeping it to themselves. And James writes that because there's an excess and it's not being used, as it corrodes, as it rots, as it spoils, that will be evidence against them. It'll be a witness in the day of judgment against these wealthy people. And so to contrast that with these laborers who are described in verse 4, these are people who didn't have means. They weren't landowners. They were day laborers. They would come and they would work the fields. And if their savings had dried up, they would be reliant on their daily wages that they had earned from an honest day's work to buy food, their daily bread on the way home to feed their families. And they don't have means to take these rich people to court when they hold back their wages by fraud. And so what do? They cry out to the Lord of hosts. And James is telling these rich people that these people that rely on you to distribute their wages, to share the wealth rightly. It's not like they're just giving it away. These people have earned their wealth. But the rich people are holding it back by fraud. And those wages are crying out as a witness against these rich people. The cries of the harvesters have reached the Lord of hosts. Last week we asked the question, what is a Christian supposed to look like? This is one of the main themes of the book of James. We've talked about how someone who has placed their faith in Jesus is wise, has the meekness of wisdom. We talked about how they tame their tongue. We don't say whatever comes to mind, but we exercise restraint with respect to our words. We're not quarrelsome. One of the phrases that we've used at River for years is this phrase, all gifted, all giving. And the idea is that we've all received gifts, right? We closed last week's sermon with this verse, a reminder that every good gift and every perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights. Everything that you have, whether it's a financial resource or an opportunity access to some resource, or even relationships, education. Everything's a gift. Spiritual gifts, certainly. And because we're all gifted and we recognize that we have received, we are all giving. We're not supposed to dam up the stream and hold it all for ourselves. The reason you are entrusted with gifts, with resources, is so that you can freely distribute. Build up the church. Provide for those around you. In verse 3 in James 5, we read that this accusation that these people have laid up treasure in the last days. And like we talked about, it's not so much the action, the behavior that James is condemning in his letter, but it's the heart behind it, right? We are all treasure hunters. And so the question isn't whether to seek treasure or not, but it's what are we supposed to be seeking? Not just what is a Christian supposed to look like, but what is a Christian treasure hunter supposed to look like? This idea of being motivated by treasure, by reward, is not a bad thing. In fact, in Matthew 10, Jesus writes that the one who receives a prophet because he is a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. The one who receives a righteous person because he's a righteous person will receive a righteous person's reward. And whoever gives one of these little ones even a cup of cold water because he is a disciple, truly I say to you, he will by no means lose his reward. Jesus is telling us that we can expect reward. It's not a bad thing. That's why marketing strategies that are based on a reward system are so effective. Maybe you go to your favorite fast food restaurant and you're trying to build up a number of points so that you can get to a certain status so that you can unlock the rewards. Like, we are motivated intrinsically as humans to do that. And it's not a bad thing, inherently. The issue becomes, as we read in Matthew 6, when we seek the wrong reward. Jesus says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal." Does that sound familiar? Likely James was thinking of these words of Jesus as he's writing to the rich people. And Jesus continues, "But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Is your treasure in your garage? I've laid up treasure in my garage. I don't collect cars, but I collect tools, and I like to use them. But do I find my identity in how many tools I have? Do I lay up treasures in my closet? In my kitchen? Do I lay up treasures in experiences on my Instagram feed? What are you seeking? That's what treasure is. It's this thing that you long for, that you're willing to sacrifice for. Some of you are willing to lay down extra sleep. You're willing to sacrifice sleep so that you can work out every day. And some of you are on the opposite camp. You're willing to sacrifice your physical health because you value your sleep more. It's a treasure issue. What do I treasure more? As we think about what does it mean to lay up treasure in heaven, though, I found this helpful chart from Dr. Thomas Constable that I wanted to share, talking about the different crowns that await us in heaven. For those leading a disciplined life, we read in 1 Corinthians that athletes compete to gain a prize, a victor's crown, a laurel wreath that they would wear on their heads that perishes. But Paul writes to the Corinthian church that we are striving as to win a prize that is imperishable, a crown that won't fade, it won't spoil, it won't wilt. It is imperishable. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul also writes, talking to the church in Thessalonica, they are his joy, they are his hope, they are his crown. So for those of you who are discipling and sharing the gospel with others, as you raise up your kids and you see them begin to walk in faith in Jesus, they are your crown, a crown of rejoicing. To see someone that you've poured so much of your heart into grow in faith and in obedience to Jesus, like that is something that you can look forward to. That is a reward that we should be striving for as believers. At the end of his life, Paul writes again talking about how he's fought the good fight. And he's looking for that crown of righteousness because he longs and loves the Lord's appearing. And everyone who loves the Lord's appearing is promised a crown of righteousness. In 1 Peter, Peter writes that those who have shepherded the flock of God faithfully will receive a crown of glory. And earlier in the book of James chapter 1, and also in the book of Revelation, we see that for anyone who has endured trials, who's remained steadfast under suffering, will receive a crown of life. So think back over the last year or two and think of the trials that you've endured and of the weight that you bore. Why do we endure? Why do we hang on to hope? Why do we again and again go to the throne of grace asking for help in this season of suffering, in a season of grief? Why not just drown those sorrows in entertainment or in substances? Why go to Jesus? Because in enduring those trials with steadfast faith, you are earning rightly a crown of life. What's the point? What's the point? If we're not building up treasures on earth in our homes or in our businesses, why should we be storing up treasure in heaven? Let's go to Revelation 4, where John is describing this vision that he had. Revelation is the only book of prophecy in the New Testament. And so John, as he's on the island of Patmos, writes, "At once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne stood in heaven, and one seated on the throne. And he who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian, and around the throne was a rainbow that had the appearance of an emerald. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clothed in white garments, with golden crowns on their heads. From the throne came flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder, and before the throne were burning 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass like crystal. And around the throne, on each side of the throne, are 4 living creatures, full of eyes in front and behind. And day and night they never cease to say, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come.' And whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to God, to him who is seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who is seated on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever. And they cast their crowns before the throne, saying, 'Worthy are you, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created.'" Now there's a lot of imagery here that we don't have time to get into. But the 24 elders, some scholars believe, represent the faithful throughout history, the 12 tribes of Israel and the remaining 12 elders representing the church, those who have placed their faith in a coming Messiah or in the completed death and resurrection of Jesus. And so the point of working for that reward in heaven is so that we may have a crown, not for our glory, but something that we could offer to the only one who is worthy. The image that came to my mind is, last week was Mother's Day, and I don't know how many of you moms got breakfast in bed, but it's that idea of a little kid waking up and maybe with dad's help, making some toast and eggs and maybe some coffee, And they carry it into the room, and maybe the coffee's spilled, or it's a little watery, or has too much cream in it, and the toast may be a little burnt, and the eggs are a little dry. But the mother delights in this offering that the kid has brought. Why? Not because it's the best breakfast she's ever had, but because of the heart of the one who made it. And there's nothing that we can do on this earth that will ever amount to being worthy of what Jesus has done for us. But the heart that we have as we handle our finances, as we use our gifts, as we exercise hospitality, giving a cold cup of water to a child, Jesus is nevertheless pleased with what we bring. And he has brought glory and honor when we live this life in light of eternity. Now, practically, what does this mean for us? I mentioned earlier that money is kind of a touchy subject for us in our culture, but doesn't need to be. And so I ask, are you handling your finances in a way that is selfish? Have you obstructed the flow of resources so that you can have more? The model that we're given is to give 10% of our income, of our wealth, to our church, which sounds like a big number in some context. But after you give 10%, the government takes 20 or 30 anyway. But the idea is that, well, I don't know if there's an idea, but I would pose the question, is it worth it? I'm not saying this because our church is financially strapped. We have a healthy amount of money due to the generosity of many of you. But for those of you who maybe give once in a while, does that reflect where you are storing up your treasure? And I know some of you may not have just a lot, and paying the bills is important, right, and necessary. Providing for your family. And there's nothing wrong with saving for your kids' college or saving up for retirement. There's wisdom in that. But does God have your first fruits? Is he the first one that you're giving to? And so as you think about that, if you're married, that's a conversation that you and your spouse need to have. There's a reason that money is the number one cause for marriages to fall apart, right? I think early in our marriage, money was arguably the number one source of conflict because we came from these two different ways of managing our resources. The way that our parents had shown us how to treat and think about money. And likely one of you, if you're married, is more generous, and one of you is less generous. And I would argue that, well, I wouldn't argue, I would just say that if you're wrestling with that, maybe default to the one who is more generous, and recognize that though you may go another year or two without getting to buy that thing or move into that house, what treasure are you storing up in heaven? How are you able to be generous today for the kingdom, such that when you get to heaven, you have another crown to offer to Jesus? We recently transitioned our accounting system to an external firm to kind of help manage everything behind the scenes. And with that, we're also transitioning our giving platform, our online giving platform. And so in the coming weeks, we'll give some more instruction about this. But if you have a recurring gift that you've set up on the existing system, this is a great opportunity for you to reconsider that amount, whether it's kept pace with any growth in your income. It's a great opportunity to review that and to say, am I offering to God my first fruits? Or am I holding something back? what would be crying out or witnessing against me on the day of judgment. Now, I want to be clear that Jesus has covered all of our sins. And we've all been selfish in the past, and we will all be selfish in the future. And when Jesus looks at you, or arguably when the Father looks at you, he will see the righteousness of Christ. And any selfishness or arrogance with which you've handled your funds will be covered by the blood of Jesus. But again, are you handling what's entrusted to you in light of eternity? Are you storing up for yourself treasure in heaven? Well, as we close, let me pray and invite the band back up. Father, again, we ask that you'd help us to let down our guard and to be honest with where our hearts are at on a day-to-day basis, where we're placing our hope. You've obviously given us structures and organizations that help us to plan for the future, that help us to secure future financial stability. But God, to the extent that we are holding that with tight fists, unwilling to let go, would you, by your grace, loosen our hands and help us to be humble and acknowledge that you alone are worthy to receive glory and honor and power, because you created all things. You created us, and you've given us everything that we have. And so we want to show our appreciation, our gratitude, and our worship to you in the way that we handle everything that you've given us. Help us do that with wisdom. And where this has become a source of relational conflict, I pray for unity, and that we as a church would support one another in that and encourage one another so that none of us may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin, these philosophies that have crept into our culture and taken root in our hearts. Don't let us be deceived. Thank you that you've given us this community. Thank you that you've given us the leadership in this church to help steer us on the straight and narrow. In Jesus' name.